All right, so I think we're going to get started here. Thanks everyone for joining us, and welcome to the first of our 6-part weekly webinar series on pollinator and beneficial insect conservation in northern New Mexico. My name's Emily May, and I'm a Pollinator Conservation Specialist with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation. This series, which we're bringing to you with our partners from New Mexico State University, is going to help you get to know the bees and other helpful bugs in your backyards and on farms in New Mexico. And we're excited to start this series on National Pollinator Week. It's going to continue on Tuesdays at 3 p.m. Mountain Time through the end of July. And we're going to talk about beneficial insects in your backyard next week. And we'll also cover designing and planting healthy habitat to support those insects and protect pollinators from pesticides later on in the series. So a couple of housekeeping notes that I've already mentioned, but we've disabled the chat, and you can submit questions through Q&A at the bottom of your screen, and we'll answer those at the end. We're excited to have 2 presenters today. We have Kaitlin Haase, who is our new Southwest Pollinator Conservation Specialist at the Xerces Society based in Santa Fe. And she is working to collaborate with and educate public and private land managers in New Mexico and the desert Southwest on pollinator-friendly practices for landscaping and gardening and open space restoration. Kaitlin comes to us with a master's degree in environmental science and policy from Northern Arizona University, where she studied aquatic invertebrate conservation and diversity. Dr. Olivia Carril has been studying native bees for over 20 years. She studied the bee fauna of Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument for her master's, and then studied a specialist bee, Diadasia, for her PhD. And in 2015, she wrote the wonderful book, The Bees in Your Backyard. We are so excited to have her come talk to us today about the bees in our backyards in New Mexico. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kaitlin to kick us off.
Great, thanks so much, Emily. Those are lovely introductions. And let me share my screen and get started on presenting. So, 1 second. Okay. So first off, I want to say happy Pollinator Week to everyone. Thank you for tuning in to the first week of our webinar series, as it is a great way to celebrate Pollinator Week. Today, we're kicking off a 6-week webinar series on supporting pollinators and beneficial insects in northern New Mexico, in partnership with New Mexico State University. In this webinar, I will introduce you to the Xerces Society. Then I will give you an overview of the different pollinators of the Southwest, their importance in agriculture systems and ecosystems, and what threats they face and how we can reduce the impact of those threats. Then Dr. Olivia Carril will take over to share her expert knowledge of native bees in the Southwest. And yes, like Emily said, feel free to type questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen as they come up. If you see something you're not sure about during my presentation or during Olivia's, and we'll answer them once both of us have finished presenting. So first off, I'd like to thank our partners at New Mexico State University. This webinar series is supported by a grant from the Crop Protection and Pest Management Program of the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture. I'd also like to thank the Carol Petrie Foundation, which helps fund the work that Xerces Society does in the Southwest to support conservation and pollinators. And finally, the Xerces Society is a member-supported nonprofit, and I'd like to give special thanks to Xerces Society members that make our work possible. So thank you, guys. Now, if you haven't heard of the Xerces Society, we are an international organization dedicated to the conservation of invertebrates and their habitat. We have staff in regional offices throughout the United States, and recently added New Mexico to that list. So very exciting to have a presence in the Southwest now. A lot of our work is dedicated to insects like bees, butterflies, fireflies, dragonflies, but also other invertebrates, which are animals without a spine or backbone, like snails and freshwater mussels. Invertebrates make up 94% of all species on Earth and play crucial roles for the production of our planet, including pollination, seed dispersal, decomposition, and are food sources for many wildlife species. Xerces formed in 1971 as an organization of butterfly scientists. We took our name from the now extinct Xerces blue butterfly, which is this butterfly right here, which was a butterfly species found only in sand dune habitats of the San Francisco Bay Area. Destruction of those dunes led to the extinction of this species, and in honoring that name, we dedicate ourselves to science-based work to protect other invertebrate species from extinction. So Xerces has 4 primary program areas, including pollinators and agricultural biodiversity, endangered species and aquatic invertebrates, pesticides, and urban conservation. We use restoration, research, education, outreach, and advocacy to further our mission. As part of our education and outreach work, we provide classes or trainings like this webinar series to inform others interested in conserving invertebrates. One initiative I'd like to highlight quickly is the Bee City Bee Campus USA program. Bee City or Bee Campus USA is a pollinator-friendly designation intended to improve local conditions for pollinators and other beneficial insects. Affiliate cities or campuses commit to creating healthy habitat, reducing pesticide use, and raising awareness through education and advocacy, and are supported in those commitments by Xerces and a network of other bee cities and bee campuses. Albuquerque is a certified bee city and is hosting a pollination celebration for Pollinator Week. So check out their website for events. Their website's down here. And if you are interested in making your city in New Mexico, if you want to add more to that state or a college campus and you want to make those more bee friendly, check out the Bee City USA website. And also feel free to reach out to me for more information. And in addition to live education events, we also have many free resources on our website at xerces.org on plants, pollinators, other insects, and habitat restoration. So check out our website to explore those documents. And we are currently working on developing plant lists and other resources specific to the Southwest. So be on the lookout for those in the near future. So enough about Xerces, let's talk about pollinators. Now that you know a little bit about what we do, while some bats and birds pollinate flowers here in the Southwest, most movement of pollen between flowers is carried out by insects. This includes insects that you probably already know of as pollinators, like butterflies and bees, but also other groups which may not immediately come to mind, like moths, flies, wasps, and beetles. All of these different insect groups visit flowers to feast on nectar as a food source, and female bees also visit flowers to collect pollen to feed their offspring. This means that most bees are more efficient pollinators compared to other insects, since they are actively collecting and transporting lots of pollen with them from flower to flower. Many bees have specialized hairs or structures on their bodies for collecting pollen. For example, leafcutter bees have pollen collecting hairs on the bottom of their abdomen, which is this part of their body right here. So they can just belly flop onto open flowers and motor around to collect pollen quickly on their belly. Those belly hairs, or scopae, make a leafcutter bee about 5 times more efficient at pollinating apple flowers than a honeybee. Another feature is that makes bees more efficient pollinators is flower constancy. So once a bee has learned how to quickly collect the pollen from a specific kind of flower, it tends to return to that same type of flower over and over again. This is more efficient for the individual bee, but also tends to result in better pollen transfer between the same flower species. One reason why the Xerces Society is excited to have a new regional office in New Mexico is that this region is a hotspot for bee biodiversity. This diversity was recognized before New Mexico was officially a state in this paper published in 1906. Although I believe we're now eclipsed by California and Arizona, New Mexico is certainly in the top 5 US states for bee diversity, with over 1,000 different species of native bees. And later Olivia will talk more in detail to the different life, history traits, and habitat needs of those diverse bee groups. One distinction to be aware of is that the honeybee, the species you're all probably most familiar with, is a pretty unique species among bees. Honeybees are not native, domesticated, and were brought to the Southwest in the 1500s by Spanish settlers. Most native bees are solitary, complete their life cycle in 1 year, and are not managed by humans. Whereas honeybees are social, living in large hives with a queen and workers that split up the duties of the colony. On a commercial side, honeybees are typically managed a bit like livestock, with hives rotated between areas of the US where crop pollination is needed throughout the year. Here in New Mexico, we also have the so-called Africanized honeybee, which is found from the very southern part of New Mexico up to Santa Fe County. The Africanized honeybees are a subspecies of honeybee with a different evolutionary history that tends to exhibit more aggressive and defensive behavior. The presence of these bees means that we are more cautious here about disturbing wild swarms than in areas where these bees have not established. So when you encounter a swarm, just don't immediately think it's going to be a very friendly swarm. So now that we know who the pollinators are, let's talk about why they are important. Pollinators are incredibly important for natural systems. They allow wild flowering plants to reproduce and continue reseeding in their environments. The seeds and fruits those flowering plants make are also food sources for other types of wildlife, from birds to mammals. So the simple act of moving pollen from flower to flower, pollinators help build out the base of the food chain for many species. They are also part of that base themselves. About 9 in 10 bird species eat insects at some point in their lives. Caterpillars, or the larvae of butterflies and moths, are an incredibly important food source for many birds, especially when feeding their young. Some birds will also occasionally eat bees, either in their larval or adult form. And insects are a tremendous source of protein. Pound for pound, insects contain more than twice as much protein as beef. And in addition to helping feeding wildlife, bees help feed us. A great visual of how much pollinators contribute to the foods we eat is this example from a project we did with Whole Foods. Here's what your typical produce section might look like when you go out for groceries. And here's what it looks like without foods that depend on pollinators. Over half of the produce items normally sold at the store are missing from the shelves, including many of the foods that put color on our plates and provide us with essential vitamins and minerals. Now, of course, that's not all. Produce is great, but pollinators are also essential for the production of some of our favorite vices. Coffee plants and cacao trees require insect pollination to make coffee beans and chocolate. Knowing how marvelous chocolate is, it may come as no surprise that the flower of the plant it comes from is also marvelous and beautiful. It's a very nice cacao flower. And its pollinator is this tiny little midge. So every time you enjoy a piece of chocolate, don't forget to thank a midge. Now to answer the question, why worry about pollinators? Many insect pollinators, including a variety of native bees, many types of butterflies and moths, are currently experiencing declines in both abundance and diversity. Insect populations do fluctuate from year to year, so it can be difficult to track patterns. But where decades-long monitoring studies do exist, they point to the same alarming patterns. And research continues to document these losses and the negative impacts on plant communities that depend on these animal pollinators. And at an international scale, an estimated 16.5 of vertebrate pollinators are threatened with extinction, and over 40% of invertebrate pollinators are facing extinction, particularly bees and butterflies. And this is why we're advocating for conservation efforts at small and large scales. But to address specific species declines, we need to know what's causing them. So the threats to pollinators are these 4 key risk factors of habitat loss, pesticide use, diseases and non-native species, and climate change. Many of the causes of decline are impacted by human behavior, which both means that we are responsible for part of the declines and that we can, but the good news is we can take steps to address those declines by changing our behavior. In New Mexico, habitat loss and climate change are particularly threatening to native pollinators for a few reasons. So the central driver of pollinator declines is habitat loss and degradation. This can take many forms, from the loss of major ecosystems like grasslands to more specific issues like pesticide contamination. One component of loss is habitat conversion, for example, development, intensive agriculture, or landscaping that is not pollinator friendly. Another part is widespread pesticide contamination, even in areas that we might think are good pollinator habitat. My colleagues on the Xerces pesticide team recently published a study this month that found ubiquitous pesticide contamination in milkweeds in California's Central Valley, even in milkweed patches in natural areas located far from agricultural land. And a third factor in habitat loss is declines of key plant species that pollinators depend on, which can be caused by herbicide use, invasion by non-native plants, and other disturbances. When good pollinator habitat is few and far between, that means pollinators cannot move to good habitat to breed or escape threats. And this is called fragmentation. In roads, cities, farms, all of those things can fragment habitat. And in urban areas, there are other factors that negatively influence invertebrates, including the urban heat island effect, where cities are warmer than surrounding areas, and the impacts of nighttime light pollution on nocturnal species like moths. In regards to climate change, the Southwest is already experiencing higher temperatures and more extreme weather, resulting in warmer winters and drier summers. The seasonal activity of many species is projected to change differentially, disrupting life cycles and interactions between species. That means pollinators could emerge or arrive in an area before or after plants bloom. And in the Southwest, large devastating wildfires are becoming more frequent, droughts more severe, and as a result, the stress of these disturbance events are shifting vegetation types. So this image shows the vegetation shift in Bandelier National Monument after a severe drought in the 1950s. The red shows where ponderosa pine forest were replaced by pinyon juniper woodland. These drastic changes at a large scale in the landscape are difficult for pollinators to adapt to. One recent study of bumblebee species in Europe and North America found significant range contractions due to climate change. In many places, climate change will exacerbate habitat loss, resulting in fewer places for pollinators to thrive. The good thing is that there are things we can do to reduce the risk of these threats. We can improve and create habitat by planting a diversity of native plants that attract and support many species of pollinators. We can reduce our reliance on and use of pesticides. We can limit disease spread by reducing risk from managed species. And we can prepare for climate change by planting diverse, climate resilient plants. So the next 5 webinars in this series will focus on how to mitigate these threats to pollinators and beneficial insects. So be sure to register or watch on YouTube. New Mexico State will upload them. And in order to conserve these bees that we have so many of in the Southwest, we need to understand them. Where do they live? When do they merge? What plants do they visit? Conservation starts with an understanding of biology and habitat needs. Fortunately, Dr. Olivia Carril has joined us today to help us get to know some of the native bees of the Southwest. So Olivia, take it away once we get our screen sharing situated.
All right. Can you guys hear me okay? Nod, Kaitlin, you can hear me? All right, I'm gonna assume that means everybody can. All right, let me share my screen with you here. I'm so glad so many of you have decided to join today to learn a little bit more about pollinators in northern New Mexico. And I want to point out that while I am focusing on northern New Mexico, many of the bees that I really highlight are quite common throughout the state and in fact across the western US. So if you don't happen to be in northern New Mexico for this, don't worry. Hopefully you'll learn something interesting. So I want to start by telling you who I am and why I'm the person here talking about these. I have been collecting bees throughout Western North America for a little over 20 years now in various places. I used to do it by myself, and these days I do it with my children. They aren't quite as happy about it as I am, but hopefully with time and practice and perseverance we'll get there. Right now, I am working on studies in Rio Grande del Norte National Monument, which is in north, sort of central New Mexico. I just am wrapping up one in Bandelier National Monument. I'm currently working with the BLM in El Malpais National Conservation Area, and I'm doing a study in a place, a private ranch up in northeastern New Mexico. As well, I'm getting ready to springboard off into doing some rare plant surveys throughout New Mexico. And as I do those surveys for bees on these rare plants, I should also be looking for bees in the community. So hopefully soon we'll know quite a bit about the bees in this area. And my kids are gonna learn about them right along with me. So I've been doing this for a long time and I haven't gotten bored yet because there's so much to learn. Every time I come back from a collecting trip and I have all of these insects on their little pins and I put them into their boxes, the kinds of bees that I see on different plants and the time of day that they're out and the habitat that I find in them leads me to ask questions. It keeps me curious every day that I'm out looking at these things. I think I have maybe one of the best jobs in the world that I get to explore my curiosity in the very moment that I have it. So it's really great. Not too long ago, I think, what year was it, 2015? I published a book and I'll show you the information on that at the end of this in case you're interested, kind of highlighting what it is that I've learned and know about bees throughout North America, mostly in the US, mostly in the West, because that's where most of the bees are. So if you're interested in learning more, you can check out that book and see what you could what other things you might end up being curious about after reading it. We think there's currently somewhere between 20 and 30,000 species of bees around the world. The number's a little fuzzy because there's areas that we haven't really explored much, we being scientists in general, and also me in particular. I would love to go to many of those places. We think there's somewhere between 3,500 and 4,000 in the US and Canada. The number's a little fuzzy because we keep discovering new species. While I was working on my master's degree in a place called Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, which is in sort of south central Utah. It's an area at the time that I did the study of right around 2 million acres. We found over 660 bee species in that area, and 40 of them were unnamed. They were new to science and wouldn't fall on this list of 3,500 named species because they don't have names. So if that's what's happening in that small piece, multiply that by huge areas that have never been explored. There's a lot to be discovered. Even here in New Mexico, there's every chance we have a lot of new species that scientists don't yet know about or know much about. We think there's around 1,000 species in New Mexico, but the number's a little fuzzy and it's a bit of a guess. We're still trying to figure out the details. So there's a wonderful website online called Discover Life, and you can go and you can see bee records and you can zoom in and learn about bumblebees or learn about wool carder bees or mason bees or whatever interests you. And on there, they have data points that they've pulled from all sorts of different digitized museum records from around the US. All of the big museums have kind of participated and put their data in. And if you zoom in on New Mexico, roughly a square like this is more or less New Mexico, you can see that there aren't actually a lot of data points here. And in fact, Kaitlin, at the beginning of her talk, highlighted a paper by a man named Theodore Cockrell, who lived in southern New Mexico at the turn of the century, so 120 years ago. And honestly, many of the records we have for the state come from his collections from that long ago, and many of these areas are really, really unexplored. Here's what I've pulled from different county records throughout the state. There are certain areas that have been fairly well sampled. I would say there's still work to be done in these places, but they're better sampled than the rest of the state. Down here in the southeast corner, Hidalgo County, southwest corner, there's just across the border in Arizona, there's a place called Portal, Arizona, and the Southwest Research Station, which is run by the American Museum of Natural History, has a bee course that they teach every year there, and they have for at least 20 years now. And so they actually know quite a bit about the bees in the area from the students who've gone through the class and collected there. Areas near universities, for example, around Las Cruces, have decent records. I know that the area of Las Cruces has more than 130 bee species. Up here around Farmington, there's been a lot of oil and gas exploration, and several rare plant studies have been done in that area, and so we know more about the bees in relation to those rare plants. And down here by Carlsbad, a study was done of Carlsbad Caverns, I think it's called, National Park. And so we know at least for that little piece of Eddy County what bees are there. And here in Socorro County, the Sevietta National Wildlife Refuge is there, and they have a wonderful ongoing long-term ecological study of that involves bees that they're doing there. So we know quite a bit about those places as well. But if you look at the rest of the state, you'll see that many places haven't really been explored. Los Alamos County has 2 bees. Obviously, there's more bees. You can walk out in anybody's backyard in Los Alamos right about now. This is a great time of year to look for bees up there, and you'll find more. What this means is that nobody has ever gone out and sampled bees in those areas and pinned them and identified them and published those records so that they exist in a sort of a peer-reviewed form, if you will. Harding County is equally poorly represented. And so one of my bucket list things, one of my life goals, is to fill in the gaps for this and try and make this list a little more complete for areas of New Mexico. So let's take a moment here and get to know and appreciate New Mexico's bees. We have some pretty amazing bees in this state, so it's going to be fun to talk about them. I want to start with making it clear that while most people, when they think of bees, think of the honeybee as sort of the I don't know, the quintessential bee for northern New Mexico. That's not really the case. I like to think of it as more the black sheep of the bee world. It's not really a good representative of most of the species that we see here. Something like this is maybe more representative. So let's talk about why. We'll start by talking about the size. So honeybee size is just one size of bees. They come in all shapes and sizes and colors and stripes and patterns too. Here's sort of a range just to give you a sense. Just so you know, this is a carpenter bee and it's on a quarter here. So for scale, that's a quarter. And that's about as big as bees come in northern New Mexico and actually in the United States and Canada as well. And then here is what we call a small mining bee. This is a Perdita. And that's more on the small end. They're quite little. But they actually get even smaller than that. We have the smallest bee. Oh, you can't quite see it here. I'll show you again later. We have the smallest bee in North America occurring right here in New Mexico, and it's called Perdita minima. It's a specialist on a leafy spurge. It's a little tiny plant in the Euphorbiaceae, and it's found in mostly in the Chihuahuan Desert. And that's that same quarter for scale. I'm so sad that I've cut that off. I will fix that by the end here so that you can see that. Most of these bees of these different sizes and shapes nest in the ground. About 70% of all bees in North America are ground nesters, meaning that each female by herself, this isn't with a hive, there's no colony, as Kaitlin mentioned, of individuals. These are solitary bees working by themselves, digging out a nest just as a gopher would or my dog on a hot day in the summer in the ground. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, these holes too. You can see that this bee really knows what she's up to here. You can see her using her forearms to kind of press at the ground and make that hole just the way she wants. She'll take out little balls of earth and throw them out as she goes deeper and deeper. And this is in the middle of a road, I should point out. This particular bee, it's one of my favorites. It's called a Diadasia. I studied them for my PhD, and it's a cactus specialist, and they seem to prefer nesting in the hardest packed earth that they can find, which is usually roads. So these nests can be a variety of sizes and shapes. Sometimes they have cute little turrets like this, so it looks like a chimney, and that's easier to see. Sometimes it's nothing more than a little tiny hole in the ground, and you really can't even see that it's there. Some bees nest in sand dunes, so where that soft sand is, they'll kind of vibrate their bodies down to where the sand gets harder and they can actually get to that hard packed earth. Some of them nest in sandstone cliffs. You name it, there is a bee that nests in that kind of substrate, earthen substrate, if you will. So what would a bee nest look like if you were to look underground? The way that we typically study this is using chalk dust. So here's some holes that have been filled in with a little bit of, like talcum powder, chalk dust, something like that. And it leaves white marks as you blow it into those tunnels that the bees have made. And so you can use a trowel and follow that white sort of trace down to get to the bee nests. Most of them are somewhere between, 6 inches for some of the smaller bees to, maybe a foot and a half for some of the bigger bees underground. Not actually that deep. And if you get to the bottom of one of those little tunnels and look, you'll see that it's a series of tiny little chambers coming off, and each of those chambers will end up with a ball of pollen that the mother bee has collected for her offspring that she leaves in there. She'll lay an egg sort of right on the top of that ball of pollen, and then usually, it depends on the bee of course, but she'll backfill that nest a little, and that one bee by itself will develop into an adult that will emerge the following year right there in that hole in the ground. And so she'll put a series of these sort of next to each other off of one main tunnel going down. And if she fills that one and wants to, she'll start another tunnel and put more eggs and pollen balls into the next one as well. Sometimes these nests, they'll get deeper than that 1.5 feet that I mentioned as sort of the range of averages depending on the species. My mentor, the guy who helped me get my start in bees 20 some years ago, was working in central Utah, a place called the San Rafael Swell, and they found a bunch of bees sort of nesting in vicinity of each other and decided to dig up a couple of the nests and learn more about them. It was a bee that hadn't been studied much. The nesting behavior hadn't been studied much prior to this. And they had to switch from digging with trowels to actually using shovels, and finally found the bottom of that nest a good 8 hours after they started, some 9 feet underground. So most bees don't nest that deep, but again, I hope you'll get the sense through this that all of the different kinds of bees have their own stories to tell and some pretty specific things for them. They think that the reason this bee nested so deep in the ground has to do with the fact that maybe the substrate that the bee was in was prime habitat and nothing around it was quite as good. And so the bees continued to use the same hole generation after generation and then build new chambers off the side of that. We don't know for sure, it's kind of a guess, but that's the thought. So the bees that aren't nesting in the ground will nest in wood. As an example, here's a leafcutter bee. You can see this is a female. She has those pollen collecting hairs that Kaitlin mentioned here on the bottom of her abdomen. And she has a little piece of leaf rolled up that she's carrying in her mandibles here that she'll take into one of the holes that you can see in this piece of wood. It may be a piece of wood that a human has engineered to create holes for their bees, but in nature, oftentimes it's in old beetle burrows, in trees that are slowly sort of decaying and falling apart. It could be in snail shells, it could be in all sorts of other natural wooden holes that are out there. So here's a picture of what might happen inside one of those holes, just to give you a sense. This is a mason bee. So mason bees, like leafcutter bees, will also nest in wood, in pieces of wood. And she has a full, let's watch that one more time. She has a full belly of pollen here, see all that? And so she's packing in the pollen that she already has. Now she does the Michael Phelps flip, and then she unloads the rest of the pollen that she has into that. And you'll notice there's a whole series of these little pollen chambers here in a row. So unlike the ground nesting bee that had one main tunnel and then several coming off, these are all in a row together. This bee over here, you can see she's using bits of chewed up leaf. She's taken leaves and kind of masticated them and made sort of a pulpy mixture that she's using to separate these masses of pollen. Some of them actually use leafy material instead and sort of origami fold it into a little envelope. And inside that, and each of those envelopes will be a ball of pollen and one egg. And one of the questions people often ask me when we're not on Zoom and they can actually ask questions during a lecture is what happens when this bee right here in the back that got laid first, that little egg that's in there, has a chance to grow and develop into an adult long before this one that's at the end. This egg is laid much later. So what's to prevent this egg in the back from chewing through all of its brothers and sisters on the way out of the nest, because the only way out is back through all of those nest cells that are in front of it. One thing that bees often do is the female gets to pick the sex of her offspring. So when she's mated, she stores the sperm from the male bee in her body in a separate little sort of organ until she's ready to fertilize an egg. As she lays the egg and decides to fertilize it, fertilized eggs become females, and the unfertilized eggs, so no sperm is released, unfertilized eggs become males. So what she'll do is lay the female eggs, which are a little more, the female bee is a little more complicated, a little more going on to develop into an adult, and males at the front, so that hopefully everyone will be ready to emerge at about the same time because they had the right amount of time in the nest. Other kinds of nests that you might see include, so here's that leaf envelope again. Sometimes they'll use bits of petal material. I have a friend in the Corrales area right now who his Oenothera, his evening primrose, is being chewed up by leafcutter bees and used to make beautiful little envelopes out of those materials. Here's one of those snail shells here, so you can see how a bee might use the snail shell. Here's a ground nesting bee again over on the side. This one was sort of this, well, it's like a cellophane material that the bee actually secretes and uses as sort of a wallpaper to paint the insides of the nest and create a waterproof little envelope that the bee and its provisions will reside in. So all sorts of different ways that bees here in New Mexico make their nests. Most of them are in the ground, but the structure, the architecture, all of those things differ even within ground nesting bees quite significantly. And just a reminder to make sure it's clear, The bees that are doing this by themselves. So each female builds her own nest, gathers her own pollen that she gets off of flowers and takes back to provide for eggs that she lays. So she's a queen in the sense that she's laying eggs, and she's a worker in the sense that she is maintaining her own home and her own progeny. Male bees don't really have nests to go to. Here's a little video. This is a bee from the east. It's called Melissodes bimaculata. It's a longhorned bee. And this was in the evening, just at dusk. I like to think of this as a bachelor pad. So these are all male bees tucking themselves in for the night together. You can see, that's kind of like my kids. They fight over the best spot at the dinner table and they kick each other out of the way. Everyone's sort of grabbing on with their mouth parts. They'll tuck their legs tight up underneath them and just kind of get stiff and stay there until morning in that spot. Other bees, and these are kind of one of my favorite things to find. This is a globe mallow flower, which is really common here in northern New Mexico. They're just starting to bloom right now. And at night, if you go out and find those flowers that it's the first day they've opened, they're not totally worn out flowers yet, you'll find male bees sleeping inside them for the night, which sounds like a great place to sleep. I would like that. So let me walk you through sort of the life cycle of these bees. I'm picking one at random here. This is a mining bee. The genus is Andrena, but I could just as easily pick a bee that came out in the summer, maybe a wool carder bee, a mason bee, or I could pick something that comes out later in the fall, like a longhorned bee, and tell the same story, but I would just sort of move the clock around a little bit. So with the mining bee, most of them emerge in the spring. So in early spring, these emerge. The males, those ones that the mother laid last, emerge first. They're ready to go earlier. They're usually the first bees that you see. So when I'm out collecting bees and I see a lot of males of some particular genus or species and no females, I know I'm at the beginning of the season for that particular bee because the males come out first. They'll usually get nectar. They'll sort of establish territories depending on the species. Some of them are very territorial. And they'll hang out and wait for the females to emerge. As soon as the females emerge, they mate with her as quickly as possible. And then she begins foraging for pollen and building her nest. Those nests, like I talked about, are usually in the ground. And by summer, that adult, that final stage in the life cycle of a bee is gone. So that the adult portion that we spend so much time thinking about and the portion that's so important for pollination is actually the shortest part of the life cycle. And a typical species may be around for 6 to 9 weeks tops, somewhere in there. So you can think of this in the same way that you might think of the fruits and vegetables you get in the market, right? There's a seasonality. There's a certain time of year that you find watermelons. There's a time of year that you find apples and cherries and strawberries and these things. So there's a seasonality to bees, just as there's a seasonality to the plants that they visit. So in the summer, the adults are done, but the larvae, those little tiny eggs that the mother laid, are in their nest with their ball of pollen, and the egg will hatch and go through hatch. Hatch is a funny word for a bee egg, but you get the point. And the larva will continue to develop in that nest. It'll go through a whole series of stages, not unlike what you might see with a caterpillar that turns into a butterfly. They go through that same complete metamorphosis. The larva continues to develop through the winter. They overwinter in this almost adult-like phase and emerge the next year, the following year, to start the cycle all over again. So quickly, just to compare that to something that's a little bit different that we see here in New Mexico. Bumblebees don't quite follow the pattern that the rest of the bees do. So in early spring, you'll see these really, really big bumblebees. Those are the first ones to come out. And that's a queen who actually survived the whole winter in a hole in the ground. And she'll emerge in the spring already mated. She was mated the previous fall and has held on to that sperm in her special organ for that all winter long. And when she emerges, she begins foraging and she builds a nest. It's usually in like an old rodent burrow, some spot in the ground, usually like a grass tussock or something like that. And she'll make a first brood of progeny, her first little batch of daughters. And these daughters, she encourages to grow very quickly. She keeps them warm by vibrating her body over the little tiny cells that they're in. until that first generation of daughters has developed completely. These bees, so the first ones that we see in the spring are usually really big, but that first generation of daughters that takes over foraging so that she can stay home and lay more and more eggs and grow the colony to a larger size are actually quite small because they developed so quickly. But then over the season, those daughters get bigger and bigger, and by midsummer, usually the nest is somewhere between 50 and 300 bees, depending on the species. Those worker bees will continue to forage and help grow the nest while the queen stays home at that point and just produces daughters. By late summer or early fall, depending again on the species, that queen stops producing those worker daughters and instead moves to producing males, and the males go off and mate with queens from other colonies, and those mated queens will overwinter and hibernate until the next year and start the cycle over again. Kind of fascinating. Many of these bees are specialists. So even though there may be lots of flowers in bloom in an area and plenty of resources for bees, they may limit themselves to some small subset of what's available when gathering pollen to feed to their offspring. It's absolutely fascinating that bees do this, but and there are many sort of hypotheses as to why this happens. It doesn't appear that they are, what's the word I want? I can't think of the word. It doesn't appear that they're doing this because their mothers gave them that kind of pollen and they're stuck on it. It seems to be something that's hardwired into their brains to visit that plant for some strange reason that we don't quite understand completely yet. And it's probably different depending on the species, but it leads people to sometimes get this idea that if there's a specialist bee, it must be visiting a specialist plant. And so there's this one-to-one relationship between bees and flowers, such that a bee that visits a sunflower, only the sunflower relies only on that bee. And that's not quite the case. It's actually a lot more complicated, and in my opinion, a little more beautiful. So let me walk you through this. I've put up pictures here of just a random assortment of different flowers that I find in northern New Mexico that often have bees on them. And here are some of the bees that occur in this area that might visit those flowers. This one here is a longhorned bee, a Melisodes, and the Melisodes females, remember that the females are the ones collecting pollen, so technically they're the real specialists. And those females are specialists on things in the sunflower family, only plants in the Asteraceae for this particular species. Mason bees, oftentimes they are specialists on things in the penstemon family, or other popular families for them are the Fabaceae, anything in the pea family. A few of them are also specialists on sunflowers. But let's just imagine, for this case, this one is a specialist on something in the penstemon. Bumblebees, because it's a colony that actually lasts for an entire season, it can't possibly be a specialist. Anything that lasts that long, honeybees included, can't specialize because no flower lasts that long. And so they are generalists. And the same is true for our green metallic sweat bees. Many of them are also generalists and will visit any plant when collecting pollen and making that pollen ball for its offspring. So now we have something that is called a pollinator network, and you can actually see how things in an ecosystem are connected to each other through the relationships of the bees and the flowers. And you can see that in fact these different plants are connected to each other through the bees that visit them. And I can make that especially clear by removing a plant. Let's say the penstemons went away, maybe because of habitat fragmentation, maybe because it was outcompeted by some other weedy plant that was in the area. Obviously, the bees that were visiting that and those relationships have to shift or go away. In the case of the bee that specializes on just that plant, it doesn't have a place there anymore. Meanwhile, some bees that maybe visited the mint to some extent, but not entirely, now shift and become more common on there, and that increases competition on that plant with all of the bees that are visiting it. So you can see how this could get complicated as we sort of shift and shuffle plants that are in an area, and why it might be important as you're planning your own garden to think about planting natives, things that are already there, and increasing the floral resources that are already present in a particular pollinator network. So this is just for fun to show you a particular specialist. This is a great bee. This is a Peponapus is the genus. It's a squash bee. It specializes on squash flowers. And in a couple weeks here, you'll be able to see them, maybe even now in some of the southern parts of New Mexico. on your squash flowers first thing in the morning. This video is taken at just before 6 o'clock, if I recall. And you can see the bee has pollen that it got on its face, and it's grooming it off of its tongue and its eyeballs and moving that pollen from its forelegs to its mid legs and from there onto its hind legs, which is where the pollen collecting hairs are. And now a male has come along. She is not interested, so she's given him the boot. You could recognize the male by the yellow on his face and the longer antenna. Male bees actually have an extra segment in their antenna, which we think is to help them locate the females, because antennae are the equivalent of noses in bees, so to speak. They use them to smell out flowers and other things. So common sense suggests that certain of our human-caused modifications to the landscape are probably not helping our native bees. It's really hard for us to quantify the declines or the increases that we might see in these different species. Likely there are winners and losers in any of these. But considering that we know what overall bee resources are and what bees need, we can guess that maybe sometimes some of the things that we do aren't very helpful. It probably depends somewhat on what bee species we're talking about. You know, ground nesters might be differently affected than twig nesters to certain environmental changes. But overall, I think we can draw some general patterns, which Kaitlin nicely highlighted a little earlier on. So anytime we remove ground nesting habitat, we remove places for our ground nesting bees to live. Anytime we plant flowers that don't attract or aren't quality plants for our native bees, we have made it a little more difficult for them because we haven't actually added floral resources, and we've probably taken some away. Sometimes some of our composting techniques, where we take off plant stems and put them in a pile or burn them even, can be detrimental to bees, because many times bees are nesting in the stems that we have removed from our plants in the fall. Anytime that we plant something that is sort of an ornamental, oftentimes these extra gorgeous petals, it's really pretty, are made at the expense of quality pollen and nectar in the plant. Anytime we put in some sort of monoculture, quite often the problem with the monoculture is that it produces an abundance of bloom and is really great for the 3 weeks that it's blooming. But after that, all of the blossoms are gone, and it's a little more of a desert from a bee's point of view. And because bees fly for such a long period of the year, this doesn't help the ones that come after that original initial bloom. We're still figuring out the extent of insecticides and pesticides on bees, partly because it depends on when you spray them and what kind you spray, and whether you're spraying leafy material or flower material. There's a lot of work still to be done to figure out how and some of the mechanisms for what's happening with these. And finally, we're finding more and more that competition with honeybees, especially in places like New Mexico, where floral resources tend to be more scarce, may be problematic to our native bees. So what do we do about these things? The solution is not too difficult. There's plenty of room, I think, for bees and humans to cohabitate, to live together without problems, because they don't really need that much. They need a food and they need a place to live. And so let's talk about what that might entail. First of all, I want you to know that you shouldn't worry too much, because bees tend to be fairly, in my experience, bees tend to be fairly opportunistic, and they try very hard to survive even when you have modified landscapes. I've seen road changes in dramatic ways, and bees still tend to persist in those areas. I've seen pavement happen. I've seen you know, flowers get replaced with monocultures of soybeans and corn, and still on the edges the bees tend to persist. So they're probably already there, but we can increase the abundance of some of those by starting with homes, providing or leaving a home for them. Undisturbed earth is a great idea for many of these bees. Weed barrier tends to be difficult for our ground nesting bees because they can't get through it, or they can't get back out once you've put it in. And leaving cavities around that happen to naturally occur in your landscape can't harm in any way at all. Kaitlin showed a great picture of a land, somebody's yard that didn't really have any flowers. And so I think this is a great contrast to that picture, just kind of demonstrating what a yard could be. So this is in downtown Salt Lake City. This is my mom's house. And you can see, I don't know, barely in the background, you can see it's all nicely manicured, mowed lawns. And she put in this beautiful xeriscaped garden, which takes up a lot less water and is also very attractive to so many kinds of bees. I think I could do a bee survey in your yard and be very happy, including bees that are specialists on some of these plants. And I don't know how they've managed to find her yard in literally the middle of this huge suburban area with very little natural resources. She has specialists on the evening primrose, she has specialists on some of her sunflowers, and she has cactus specialist bees that are right there and have found her yard and have taken up residence. If you want to provide food for bees, consider having things that bloom from the spring through the fall, considering that each of our native bees has a season and that there are bees that need resources pretty much from that first early flowering stuff all the way through that first frost. Include a diversity of colors, shapes, sizes, and of course plant families to encourage as many of the specialist bees and cooperation with the generalists that are also there. Plant natives as often as possible and don't be overwhelmed. It's really okay to start with just one kind of plant. Some that are really successful with bees, especially in northern New Mexico, that you can think about are things in the sunflower family. They tend to attract a good diversity of both generalists and specialists. Anything in the mint family, if you can handle the fact that that mint is going to take off and spread and cover a whole bunch of your yard. Even Russian sage, strange as that sounds, that plant, wherever I find it in the middle of downtown Santa Fe, seems to always have bees on it. It's very strange to me. Not the best example of a native, but nonetheless, it does quite well. And then to really enhance your appreciation of these, learn about them, learn about these bees that you're working so hard to support and encourage in your yard. They're really fascinating creatures and they all have something interesting to learn about. So I'm going to highlight a few and tell you about them. This is one that you're guaranteed to see if you start looking. They're super abundant and common. I showed you a little video of one earlier. This is the green metallic sweat bee. And they really like Gaillardia, the blanket flowers that are around here. I seem to see them on there. And it could just be that the green color of them contrasts so nicely with the flower that they really pop and show up. But that's a fun one to look for. They have an interesting life cycle that actually lasts longer than most. So you can see them from pretty much May, I would say through September, you can probably find the green metallic sweat bees around. So they're kind of fun to look for. There's a handful of different species in the area. I think, see if I can remember, I think there's 10, maybe 10 species, 10 or 12, I can't remember now. Different species that you can see throughout North America. They're a little tricky to tell apart from each other, but that genus is pretty well represented, and so it's one that you have a good shot of being able to see. They collect pollen on their legs. You might be able to see on this lady, there's just a little bit of pollen down here on her leg. That's where her scopal hairs are. This one is awesome, and if you happen to be in central or southern New Mexico, you're especially likely to see this. There's a few of them that are specialists on creosote and only visit creosote flowers. So if you find the creosote, you'll see these. They're called oil digger bees, and I'll explain why here in a minute. I call them the devil bees. Look at those eyes. They have red or green eyes that are kind of amazing to look at. And they hover in front of the creosote, and they vibrate, and they're loud and really obnoxious and hard to miss. Totally harmless. They won't sting you or reach out to you in any way. But several of them are specialists on flowers that produce a floral oil, and they'll actually use their front legs. They have these special little hairs on their legs that they'll use to kind of scrape the oil out of the flower and take it back as an extra source of nutrition for their offspring. So that's why they're called oil digger bees. Digger bees because they nest in the ground, and oil for the floral oils that they're scraping off. As you can see on this one, they also collect pollen. You can see this giant mess of pollen on her hind legs here. Just a really cool bee to keep your eyes open for. Bumblebees, we couldn't not talk about bumblebees. Let's see, there are about 20 species in New Mexico, different species. Some of the eastern ones are kind of easy to tell apart, but our bees here in In New Mexico, our bumblebees are a little trickier. There are some pretty subtle variations between the different kinds. Nonetheless, they're really fun to look for and watch. And they, again, are one that's out for a really long period of the year. So that makes them even easier to see. I find them in my yard a lot on mint flowers. They don't visit globe mallow and some of those things so much. As you head up into the mountains, if you go hiking in the sandias or the sangres or something like that, the hemas even, you're likely to see these right now at some of those higher elevations. They like plants like Phacelia, pedicularis, a lot of those high mountain, even longer tubular flowers. I have to give a shout out. This is Diadasia. These are cactus and mallow bees, and they're actually really important to pollination of our cactus that we find around here. While many bees will visit cactus flowers and collect pollen off of them because they have a lot of pollen, it's a great resource. Not many of them are very good pollinators because they don't actually visit the stigma. That's the yellow piece in the middle, the female receptive part of the flower. So in essence, they're stealing the pollen from those. Diadasia, the cactus bees, on the other hand, are so big, it's almost impossible for them to visit the flower without also affecting pollination. So they're real fun to watch. They often nest in aggregations, and these are the ones that I said really like to nest in hard packed earth. So you'll often see them along the side of a hiking trail where it's really hard packed, or maybe in the middle of a road. There's several places up in Rio Grande del Norte National Monument where I found them in or right next to roads. Many of them make these little chimneys or periscopes on the top of their nests, which are kind of cool to see. And if you see that, you can be guaranteed that's the kind of bee that's there. So here's just a picture of one. There's about 30 species in North America. They mostly specialize on either globe mallow, and those are kind of smaller bee, or cactus, and those ones are a little bit bigger. There's a couple others that do their own thing. That's a story for another day. I have to, of course, mention the cuckoo bees. This is one of the most common that you see here, especially in the spring. They're more of a spring bee. The cuckoo bee is what we call a kleptoparasite. And what they do is they sneak into the nest of a normal bee when she's not home, in the same way that a cowbird does this, and sneaks into the nest of another bird and lays an egg. And then the mother bee doesn't know that that egg, that foreign egg, that alien egg, is in there. And she finishes building that little nest cell and seals it off and leaves, not knowing there's now 2 eggs in that cell. The cuckoo bee egg tends to hatch first, and it usually kills the host bee and then eats the pollen that was left in the nest, completes its life cycle, and emerges the next year to do it all over again. So many of them are bright red, or a bright red and yellow color, and have kind of a waspy look, mostly because they don't collect any pollen on their own and don't really have any need of those pollen collecting hairs. This is a leafcutter bee doing the belly flop that Kaitlin mentioned here, just flopping right in there to the cactus flower. Leafcutter bees are really common right now. Now is a great time of year to see them. They're really common on sunflowers. You'll also see them on, well, clearly on the cactus flowers. What else do I see them on a lot? Anything in the pea family. If you've ever looked at a flower like a sweet pea, it has that keel at the bottom, and all of the anthers are hidden inside that keel. These bees have the ability to pull the 2 petals of the keel apart so that those anthers are exposed, and when they are, they actually tickle the abdomen of the leafcutter bee and deposit pollen right there for them. So kind of a cool little adaptation that they have. There's about 50 species in the Western United States, and they can be a little tricky to tell apart. And of course, mason bees. I see that I cut the word mason or bee off there at the side. At this point, you should know that's what's there. Mason bees are mostly a spring bee, but there is a suite of them that comes out in the fall. Many of them prefer to visit flowers in the Rosaceae, although they aren't true specialists on it. They just seem to maybe be out at the time that a lot of the rose flowers happen to be going. And then finally, I have to show you a wool carder bee here. These guys are also really common right now. They seem to get a lot of nectar off of the Russian sage, so you'll see them visiting Russian sage. And they're called wool carder bees. Can you see that pollen? I'm going to show that again just in case you missed it. Sorry, not pollen, the cotton ball. They actually card the plant fuzz off of like a lamb's ear or something like that. You might be able to see in her mandible, she's got this little cotton ball, and they take it back to the nest and use it to sort of pad the nest where her offspring are. So that's a really neat bee. You can recognize them by the yellow and black markings on them, and the fact that they tend to hover near their plants in a pretty distinctive way, that hovering in the air, sort of moving around. It makes me think of Airwolf from the 1980s, but maybe I just told you how old I was and maybe I shouldn't have talked about that. And then of course we have the longhorned bees. These will be coming out here in a couple weeks. Many of them, again, specialists on sunflowers. I'm telling you, that's a really good plant for bees. And the males have these really long antennae. In case you were wondering what they use those antennae for, I have this little video for you. The males use their long antennae in mating, maybe to keep the female calm. I'm not really sure. I am most amazed at the dexterity they have with their antennae. I was unaware that they could do that. Kind of cool. Most of them are really hard to distinguish at the species level, but those long antennae should clue you in on what kind of bee you're looking at. So that's just kind of amazing. And then of course we have to talk about the small mining bees. That's that same tiny little Perdita, itty bitty little bees. They come out mostly in the fall. And if you have rabbit brush or chemisa near your house, take a look at the swarming sort of mass that you see over it. Many of those will be your small mining bees. There's also a few that are specialists on creosote, which is kind of cool. So just for skies, you can see this is a Rocky Mountain bee plant. That's a little tiny Perdita right there. So small, it's about the size of the anthers on that thing. And then we have carpenter bees. The carpenter bees in New Mexico are really neat because we don't see them so much in northern New Mexico. We're like right at the border, so occasionally they show up here, but mostly Albuquerque and further south they're more common. And the ones out here, many of them nest in yucca plant stems. So if you look at the base of a yucca stalk that's done and kind of dried out, you'll see a hole at the base, and that hole is where the carpenter bee has drilled a little hole, chewed it up with her mandibles, and climbed up it to put a whole series of nest cells inside. Kind of amazing bees. Okay, there is your quick and dirty tour of many of the bee species that we can find here in New Mexico. I hope that you saw that many of them are quite different from each other, that there's a lot of variety in the life histories, in the plants that they visit, in when they're out and how they live. And I hope it's kind of inspired you to maybe take a closer look at bees and do a little more research on your own. There's a lot of great resources, especially on the Xerces Society's webpage, to help you learn more about these. If you have questions and don't get a chance to ask me during the Q&A right now, feel free to email me. You can reach me at the Bees in Your Backyard. Joe, my co-author, is also there, Joe Wilson, so one of the two of us will definitely get back to you. And we also post a fair amount of information about bees and bee behavior on our social media sites, so feel free to reach out there if you'd like. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing this screen now, and we'll take any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia, for that awesome presentation. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and a lot, I tried to stay on top of them, but there were quite a few that came in. So there were a couple questions about nesting habits. Are there any communal nesting bees, like the way that Halictus sometimes share a common entrance?
Kaitlin, I'll answer these bee questions unless you want to jump in with something. So I don't want to step on your toes, but that green metallic sweat bee that I talked about, they oftentimes share a nest entrance, but when you get inside the nest, they actually have their own little apartments, if you will. So they walk into the same apartment door, but inside they all have their separate things going on. And the thought is that that might minimize parasitism because there's one entrance, but then the chances that a parasite, a kleptoparasite like one of those cuckoo bees actually gets to your particular apartment door is lessened. So yes, there are bees that share a door at the beginning. Also, the chances of the entire apartment complex being empty at the same time so that the cuckoo bee can go undiscovered is reduced. So it's a strategy for maybe minimizing parasitism. Many bees nest in aggregations. Sometimes it'll be like, 5 or 10, maybe a dozen bees in an area, but it can be several hundred bees, maybe 400 or 500, all nesting in an area together.
I got a couple questions about online references. Is there a good website for identifying bees? And then is there a reference online for the specialized bees that have a correlation to their preferred flowers?
I found one not that long ago, but it was for the Midwest. I don't think there is one currently for Western North America. The Great Sunflower Project has quite a bit of information, and that might be a place to look. The Xerces has plant lists, but I don't know if I don't think there's much about the specialist bees associated with those plants, is there?
No, we have a pollen specialist bees of the Northeast there's a reference from Jared Fowler and Sam Droege out there. The only other thing I could think of is that Discover Life often lists plant records for different bee species, which is also where Olivia had directed you to look earlier for lists of bees and some identification.
Another place to look or even to post a photo if you're trying to figure out what something is Bug Guide. I really like Bug Guide, and they have a lot of great information about different species, even at the species level for bees.
Kaitlin, I have a question for you, which is there a system or organization tracking the success or not of pollinator corridor highways? With habitat loss, it seems corridors would be pretty important.
Corridors are definitely very important connected pollinator habitat. As for really good tracking of that, I'm not sure. I just know of.
And your audio is very strange. Do you have the audio set to the right speaker? We could come back to that question.
Can you hear me better?
It's probably an internet issue. Yeah.
Maybe you can type it in a chat or something and we can say it out loud for you.
Okay, sounds great.
Okay, in the meantime, Olivia, what do the male bees of the ground nesting variety do if the females do everything on their own and live alone?
They'll defend their territories, and there's actually some species that like mark with scent the edges of a plant that they've decided is their territory. So they spend a lot of time sort of arguing with each other over who's going to do what when. But then at night they all huddle up on a plant together and seem to get along. So that's pretty much all they do. Now, from an ecosystem perspective, I have to give them credit because they also visit flowers for nectar. They don't collect pollen to take it back to the nest, but maybe that's not a bad thing because they still get dusted with pollen and they don't actually shunt it down to pollen collecting hairs on their bodies. And so there's some argument that they may be better pollinators in some cases because the pollen isn't sort of hidden away on their bodies as they move from flower to flower.
With our native bees having such short and specific periods of time that they emerge, how do you go out and start sampling those missing zones around New Mexico and know that you're accurately capturing the area's bees as opposed to just who happened to be out the days that you were there?
That's a great question. Obviously, I have to think about this a lot for my collecting techniques. And so with the window being 6 to 9 weeks, I figure the longest I can go between visits to an area is 7 to 8 weeks. So if I'm really stretched thin and don't have enough time, I try and visit an area every month and a half to try and capture at least the spring, the main summer, and the main fall fauna. Ideally, with enough funding and enough time, I'm visiting my plots I have actual standardized plots so I can quantify the bees that are in them, and I visit them every month. So every month I'm out collecting the same area, again, to capture the bees, the next suite of bees that are in an area.
Thanks. To address a couple of common questions, this is going to be posted on YouTube after this, so it will go up on the New Mexico State and Xerces Society YouTube channels. It's probably going to take a week or two. We have Jenny, who's in our panelists, is live captioning this presentation, and we will be correcting those captions before they go up on a recorded webinar, but it will be available so that you could watch any time. The other piece that I did want to address, we had a couple of comments about our language in the initial presentation about wanting to make sure that we were being appropriately anti-racist and decolonizing our language around both sort of the Africanized honeybee as well as how we deal with colony as a term and Spanish colonization of New Mexico. I'm just going to say that we are going to take the time to reflect and make sure that we are appropriately going through our language to make sure that we are addressing that in a way that decolonizes our language. Ecology is full of that. I think conservation in general is full of that, that kind of language, native and non-native. There's a lot of sort of xenophobic language around that. And so we are gonna, thank you for bringing it up, and we are gonna address that as a larger organization. I think there's a few more questions for you, Olivia. Are native bees as susceptible to the colony collapse problem seen with honeybees?
So because they're solitary bees, there's no colony to collapse. So the term can't really apply to our solitary bees in any meaningful way. Not to say there aren't other threats to them, including pathogens. There are plenty of pathogens, even pathogens that can move from things like Apis mellifera, the honeybee, to our native bees. But the colony collapse sort of phenomenon isn't one of the things that we can apply to solitary bees.
Thank you. I'm getting a lot of them here at the end. Is the smoke from the wildflower fires affecting bees?
I don't know. That's a great question. I mean, they're able to smell their flowers, and whether particulate matter, extensive particulate matter in the air might affect their ability to smell out their flowers. I'm not sure. If you're really close to a wildfire and it's so dark that they can't see, the ultraviolet's not coming through and the flowers look different, I suppose that would be an issue. But I suppose also that if the smoke is making the sunlight that dark, the bees should be running because they have bigger problems than finding floral resources. I think in general, I don't know that that's been studied, really.
There are some studies of like how bees recover from wildfires, but not so much how the smoke from the wildfires might be affecting them. Yeah. There's a couple questions about collection. So I'm assuming we're not going to be talking about how to collect and pin on this webinar, but there is a question about the justification for collecting them by killing them instead of other methods due to the subtleties involved in photographing them. Is there going to be movement in the direction of stopping collecting animals for scientific study? Curious to see what you have to say about collection.
So for my purposes, I don't intend to stop collecting bees anytime soon. Many of the details that I need to see in order to identify my bees, I'm using, I can turn here, I use this microscope right here. It's a pretty nice fancy one. And a lot of the features that I have to look at on these bees to really tell what species they are and to tell whether it's a new species are minute, to the point of, are the hairs on the tongue curved or straight? It's ridiculous, the features that you have to look at, and there's no way to take a photograph of that. The only way is to take a sample. So that being said, I will argue also that I am taking a sample, and it's pretty small. The estimate about the number of bees per acre is quite large, and the samples that I take amount to maybe 1 or 2 bees per acre per year. So it's not a huge sample. It seems like it, but when you're dealing with 250,000 acres, it's going to seem like it. But on the grand scale of things, it's actually a pretty small sample.
Kaitlin, I don't know if your microphone and internet situation has improved. Do you want to talk about pollinator corridors if it works?
Yeah.
That sounds better.
Okay, good. Thanks. Yeah, so corridors are definitely very important because we're dealing with a lot of habitat loss in pollinators, and the monitoring efforts I don't think are, I mean, that's kind of a problem with a lot of restoration and conservation work, is that we don't have the time, the funds to do a lot of monitoring to see how that success is. I remember talking with you, Olivia, about some monitoring effort where they were looking at maybe species presence, but not was was the actual populations growing, or yeah. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of room for improvement in monitoring the success of pollinator corridors. But yeah, that's something I should look more into and see if there are good examples of people doing that.
I think one of the things to mention might be that we are looking at building greater connectivity in general, especially in our urban spaces in New Mexico, through Albuquerque and New Mexico, and Santa Fe, sorry. That there's a lot of interest in how you can take habitat patches and allow bees to sort of move more freely through those environments. So connecting green spaces with people's backyards. And we're going to talk more about that in future webinars as we talk about how you can create that habitat in your backyards. One question about, there were actually a couple questions about bee hotels. So would you recommend or discourage the building of pollinator hotels? I've heard some discourage them due to the potential for the spreading of pathogens. And if you do have a bee hotel, what's the best time to clean it out?
So living in New Mexico and spending a lot of time in the West, I've never invested much time or effort into the bee hotels for the simple reason that they don't seem to do well here. I am so jealous of people in Pennsylvania that actually have to think about cleaning them out because they have things living in them. We have so many ground nesters here compared to our twig nesters that it's very seldom that I see them occupied substantially. I do see them near acequias or near the Rio or near some other major waterway. There tends to be better occupancy, and I think it's because the kind of bees that nest near rivers and riparian areas tend to be twig nesters. So if you live in those areas and you really want to explore getting bees to nest in there, the best time of year to clean those out, let's see, what would it be for New Mexico? Wait till everything's done. So a good sort of rule of thumb is after maybe 1 or 2 frosts, so you can be guaranteed everything is done for the year, would be a good time if you want to clean those out. It's going to depend a little on where you are, right? So higher elevations in northern New Mexico versus down by Albuquerque. But wait till there have been a couple frosts or at least really cold periods before you do that.
And there are bee hotels that are able to be more easily cleaned, like I think they're called binder blocks, where you can actually pull pieces apart and take the cocoons out. And I'm assuming Olivia has one. There's also some that you have that have paper lining tubes. Oh, so yeah, this is the binder block where you can actually pull it apart, and it's much easier to clean than something you've drilled holes into but isn't able to fall apart.
So each of these sort of comes apart, and you can have little straws in there and clean those out and keep them clean.
Yeah, great question. So we just have a few more minutes here. How do people who are allergic to bee stings protect themselves without harming bees? So all I can say on this is that I'm allergic to bees, even though I studied them for my master's. And really it comes down to sort of being observant and hoping that they never get caught in your clothing. But generally speaking, bees are not aggressive. And I carry an EpiPen with me when I'm out, just for safety, and lots of Benadryl, but I've never actually had that much reason to worry, even when I was collecting them directly, just by being careful and observant of their behavior.
Emily, I saw someone asked a question about what again was the bee that nests in the hard-packed earth. They were by Placenta. So just to answer that quickly, the bee is a cactus bee. It's called Diadasia is the genus.
Yeah, feel free to go through the list of questions yourself if there's any that you particularly want to answer.
I saw one that was, what are the bees putting circles in my rose? The leaves of roses. Leafcutter bees really like roses, right, Olivia?
They sure do. For some reason, leafcutter bees are especially partial to roses, so guaranteed. And there's actually people researching this right now. There's some thought that perhaps the kind of plants that leafcutter bees pick to make those have medicinal properties, and that they may be picking them because they help resist pathogens or bugs or who knows whatever other things. But there's still a lot of research to be done about why bees pick the leaves that they do.
Yeah, and that's actually a good time to answer one of the other questions in here, which is about community science projects. So getting sort of crowdsourcing of information and data. So we have a couple of different community science opportunities for people in the Southwest. One is nationwide, it's Bumblebee Watch. So it's just taking pictures of bumblebees and submitting them to Bumblebee Watch. We also have the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper, which is any observations of milkweeds or monarchs. Again, taking a picture and uploading it to the Western Monarch Milkweed Mapper. And we are just about to launch, part of Pollinator Week is a project looking at stem nesting bees and bees' use of nesting resources. So just like that, if you see bees that are cutting leaves out of a particular plant in your yard, we want you to put that into our little database of what plants are bees actually using. So we will have information about that coming out through our social media channels later this week. And we would love you to contribute to that. If you see, you know, Serotina nesting in your bee balm, we want to know about it. So that's something that you can stay tuned for later this week.
Can I chime in on that, Emily? Something that maybe people aren't aware of is that most of bee research up until maybe, I don't know, 10 or less years ago was done by scientists interested in promoting them as alternative pollinators. So a lot of work has been done on mason bees, especially some of the leafcutter bees and some of these other ones that can either work with the honeybees to increase seed set in our orchards or substitute for honeybees if the honeybees are having a hard time. That being said, a lot of these other bees that we haven't thought of as particularly good pollinators of our orchards haven't been studied. And a lot of what you might think of as anecdotal and silly information that you see in your yard, scientists don't know about. It's not known. There are a whole bunch of twig nesting bees that don't go to orchards, that we don't know what kind of bee houses they would like. We don't know what size of the tubes and all of those things. So there's a lot that people who are observant can really contribute by just taking a picture or two and putting it in a central repository like the Xerces has created.
Okay, I think I'll make this the last question, Olivia. Could you talk about your next book? You have some groupies in the chat.
So we are working with Princeton University Press on actually 2 books. They're kind of like complements of each other. One is for the Eastern North America, and one is for Western North America. And they're sort of species level guides. So while the bees in your backyard sort of focused at the generic and covered that, this will be a little more specific in that it might give information on how to identify some of the more common bees. So it's not going to include everything. Obviously, there's like 770 bees east of the Mississippi River, and many of those are very difficult to tell apart from each other without a lot of time and a lot of keys. But we picked out some of the more common ones, and we're putting a book together that's a species level guide to some of those. The Eastern one will come out first. The Western one will come out next. And the Eastern one will be submitted to Princeton so that they can turn it into a book in exactly 7 days. So expect it, I think next June is what they said. By next June, the Eastern one will be out. And I can't say with the Western, it will depend some on what they tell us to do.
Awesome. Can't wait for that.
Me either.
So I know that there were some questions that we weren't able to get to today. I did want to mention that the last webinar in our webinar series is an Ask Me Anything expert roundtable discussion with our partners at NMSU. So if you have questions that we didn't answer, but you really want to have answered, email nmsuipm@nmsu.edu, and we will try to get to those as part of the panel discussion on our final webinar date, which is at the end of July. So thank you so much, Kaitlin and Olivia, for your presentations today. It was really great. I loved seeing all of those videos. I had never seen the male leafcutter bee. That was amazing. Or not leaf, longhorn bee, sorry. But we really enjoyed your presentations, and we're looking forward to the next one in the series. Have a fun rest of your Pollinator week. There will be a feedback form that pops up as you exit the webinar, so if you have time, feel free to fill that out. and hope to catch you at the next one. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy and Olivia.